In the Soviet Union, the calendar could feel like it belonged to the state as much as the streets did. Not just the work week, not just the holidays, but the rhythm of ordinary hunger. For millions of people, one small phrase captured that feeling with almost comical precision: Thursday is fish day. It sounds like a harmless quirk, a cafeteria tradition, the kind of detail you'd expect in a nostalgic memoir. But in the USSR, nothing that touched food was harmless, and nothing about feeding a continent-sized country was merely tradition. Fish Day was a policy, a signal, and a confession. It was the state admitting without saying it directly that it could not reliably provide what people wanted most: meat. And to understand why the Soviet government ended up trying to train an entire population to eat fish on command, you have to follow the chain of decisions that began not in the kitchen, but in the fields, in the grain requisitions, in the livestock slaughter, and in the political logic of a system that tried to plan nature itself. The first Soviet Fish Day did not begin as a joke. It began as damage control. In the early 1930s, the Soviet state drove collectivization through the countryside with extraordinary force. The campaign to eliminate so-called kulaks as a class, the seizure of grain, and the imposition of aggressive procurement quotas and food taxes tore through peasant life. One consequence was immediate and measurable: livestock numbers collapsed. Peasants, facing confiscation and the loss of private property, slaughtered animals rather than surrender them to collective farms. Pig breeding, in particular, suffered a crisis. The result was not simply a shortage of pork in city markets. It was a broader reduction in livestock that undermined the food supply at the very moment the regime was pushing rapid industrialization and packing workers into expanding urban centers. This was the same period that ended in mass famine across several regions of the Soviet Union in 1931–33, a catastrophe intertwined with policy and coercion, and remembered most starkly in Ukraine and the grain-growing regions of the south, but felt in hunger and rationing far beyond. In 1932, Anastas Mikoyan, then People's Commissar for Supplies, later to become Minister of the Food Industry, looked at the numbers and saw a political problem that could not be solved by slogans alone. Mikoyan was not a romantic about food. He was a hard-edged manager and survivor, a man who would navigate Stalin's court and outlive it, who understood that the legitimacy of a state claiming to represent workers could be undermined by empty plates. Meat shortages were not just inconvenient, they were destabilizing. So Mikoyan reached for a substitute that the Soviet Union could, at least in theory, produce in large quantities without rebuilding the livestock sector overnight: fish. That year, Mikoyan issued an order to introduce a weekly fish day in public catering establishments. It was not necessarily tied to Thursday at the beginning. The core idea was administrative and blunt. One day a week, canteens in factories and institutions would serve fish instead of meat. The policy targeted the places where the Soviet state had the most direct control over what people ate: the network of public dining rooms that fed workers, students, and employees. The USSR was building an industrial civilization, and the canteen was one of its key mechanisms. You could not easily force every household to cook a certain way, but you could shape the diet of millions by controlling the menus where they ate lunch. Fish cutlets, fish croquettes, fried fish soup forms that could be standardized, portioned, and cooked in bulk became the instruments of policy. The justification was framed in the language of nutrition and modernity. Fish, officials emphasized, was rich in easily digestible protein, phosphorus, iodine, and other nutrients. In a country where malnutrition and monotonous diets were constant threats, that argument had real scientific weight. But the deeper logic was economic and political. Fish could take pressure off scarce meat supplies, and it could be scaled through industrial processing. This was the Soviet approach in miniature. A shortage appeared, and instead of allowing prices to adjust or letting consumption patterns shift organically, the state attempted to re-engineer demand and supply simultaneously. It would not just catch fish, it would catch the public's appetite. Propaganda followed policy like a shadow. The Soviet government did not merely introduce fish into canteens, it tried to make fish feel inevitable, progressive, even patriotic. Posters and displays promoted fish products aggressively. Slogans appeared in public dining rooms and shops: insisting that fish belonged on the menu and that fish dishes made meals more diverse. The message was carefully chosen. Diversity was a promise of modern life, a subtle admission that the Soviet diet could be repetitive and an attempt to turn necessity into virtue. Even the language of abundance, "there's always room on the menu for fish," was a kind of preemptive defense against the accusation that the state could not provide enough of everything else. Behind the posters was an institutional machine. At the dawn of the Soviet state, a main directorate of fisheries was established under the People's Commissariat for Supplies. Bureaucracies in the USSR were never just administrative. They were political instruments, and they reflected priorities. Fish mattered enough to be organized, regulated, and expanded as an industry. Then, in 1939, the Soviet leadership decided to elevate fisheries further, creating a separate People's Commissariat for Fisheries. That was not a minor bureaucratic reshuffle. In Stalin's system, a commissariat was power, resources, and attention. It meant that fish was no longer simply one product among many. It was a strategic category of food, tied to industrial capacity and national planning. The appointment at the top of that commissariat was also revealing. It was headed by Polina Zhemchuzhina, the wife of Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister and one of Stalin's most prominent lieutenants. In a regime where connections mattered and where political trust was everything, placing someone with that proximity at the head of fisheries suggested the importance the state attached to the sector. Zhemchuzhina's tasks were not limited to catching more fish. One of her central missions was to develop the canning industry. This point matters because it shows how Soviet leaders thought about geography and logistics. The USSR was vast, with long distances between coasts and inland cities, with infrastructure that was improving but still strained. Fresh fish could not reliably reach every table. Canning, by contrast, was industrial, storable, transportable. It was the technology that could turn the ocean into a standardized commodity that could travel by rail and end up in a shop in Moscow, in the Urals, in Siberia. Under this push, dozens of types of canned fish products appeared in stores: sory, salmon, sprats, and more. The emphasis on variety served two purposes at once. It was practical because different fisheries and seasons produced different catches, and it was ideological because variety itself was a propaganda weapon. The Soviet state wanted people to believe that socialism could provide not only the basics, but a modern consumer experience. Canned fish became a kind of edible proof of industrial achievement. When you opened a tin, you were supposed to taste planning, technology, and the reach of the state. These products also reshaped domestic culture in ways that outlasted the Soviet Union. Housewives working within the constraints of availability, queues, and whatever the local store happened to have built recipes around what was reliable. Sprats became sandwich staples. Canned fish entered festive salads that still appear on post-Soviet tables, including layered dishes like herring under fur coat and mimosa made with pink salmon. This was not a trivial culinary trend, it was adaptation. In an economy where supply could be unpredictable, people learned to anchor celebrations in foods that were shelf-stable and widely distributed. The state wanted fish to solve a meat problem, but it also ended up imprinting fish onto the rituals of everyday life. And then there was caviar, one of the most striking contradictions of Soviet food history. Until Stalin's death in 1953, black and red caviar could be relatively inexpensive and accessible. The Caspian Sea fisheries, actively exploited and farmed, made caviar a major export. In the imperial era, caviar had been consumed willingly by those who could afford it. In the Soviet context, however, it did not always fit popular habits. There were even propaganda efforts urging people to eat at posters that effectively instructed citizens to train themselves into appreciating what the state could produce and sell. The phrase, "make yourself eat caviar," captured something essential about Soviet consumption. Taste was not merely personal. It was something that could be corrected, educated, managed. The state did not just want to feed people, it wanted to shape what they desired. Then came the war, and the entire logic of food shifted. During World War II, the Soviet Union fought for survival on a scale that consumed everything: industry, manpower, agriculture, transport. The fisheries lobby, the promotional campaigns, the grand plans for consumer variety, all faded behind the brutal priorities of wartime rationing and supply. Food became calories, not cuisine. The canning industry still mattered, but the story of fish as a peacetime substitute for meat was temporarily drowned out by the larger catastrophe. After the war, the Soviet Union rebuilt, and by the 1950s, a new wave of mass-produced canned goods emerged, including cheap and popular products like sprats in tomato sauce. These were the kinds of foods that fit the post-war Soviet reality: affordable, durable, easy to distribute, and easy to eat without elaborate preparation. A legend circulated that Nikita Khrushchev, after tasting sprats in tomato, praised it as an ideal dish. Whether or not the remark was exactly as remembered, the story itself mattered because it reflected a broader truth. Soviet leaders often tried to legitimize products through their own supposed preferences, presenting mass food as something endorsed from the top. Sprats in tomato became a staple, especially among students, hikers, and drinkers looking for a salty snack. In that detail is another Soviet reality. Canned fish was not only a planned substitute for meat, it became a social lubricant, part of the informal culture that surrounded shortages and hard living. The 1960s added another layer. The USSR pursued ocean fishing on a massive scale, turning itself into a leading high-seas fishing nation. This was part of a wider Soviet impulse to master environment: steppe, tundra, space, ocean, and to translate that mastery into industrial output. But high-seas fish often reached consumers frozen, not fresh, and it introduced species and textures unfamiliar to many inland citizens. Here the limits of planning showed up again. It is one thing to catch millions of tons of fish. It is another to ensure that people know how to cook it, want to cook it, and can cook it with the tools and ingredients available. A freezer full of unfamiliar fish did not automatically become dinner. The Soviet state could mobilize fleets, but it could not easily mobilize taste. By the mid-1970s, the old problem returned with new urgency. After another meat shortage in 1976, the leadership moved again to impose a fish day, this time with a specific day of the week fixed by decision of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. This second introduction is the one most people remember because it stamped itself onto routine. The state settled on Thursday. Why Thursday? Officially, the reasoning was practical. Thursday was considered the best day for fish sales. In the rhythm of the Soviet workweek, that could mean several things at once. Monday was the start of the week, when supply chains and production schedules reset. Tuesday and Wednesday were heavy workdays. Friday was the threshold of the weekend, and in many workplaces, attention drifted. By placing Fish Day on Thursday, the state aimed for a moment when canteens were fully operating, when workers were still in the weekly routine, and when the distribution system could be synchronized. It was an attempt to maximize compliance through scheduling, to make fish consumption not an occasional substitute, but a predictable, weekly habit. But there was also another interpretation, persistent and widely repeated, that Thursday was chosen as a deliberate jab at Orthodox Christian practice. In traditional Orthodoxy, fasting days are Wednesday and Friday. The Soviet regime, officially atheist and often aggressively anti-religious, had long tried to weaken religious customs and replace them with Soviet rituals. Choosing Thursday for Fish Day could be read as an effort to ensure that the state's dietary directive did not align with religious fasting, and assertion that Soviet life would not revolve around the church calendar. Whether the decision-makers saw it primarily as economic scheduling or ideological provocation, the fact that people interpreted it through the lens of religion shows how deeply politics had penetrated the kitchen. Even a cafeteria menu could be read as a cultural battle. The problem was that policy could mandate fish, but it could not guarantee pleasure. Workers often disliked Fish Day not because they were irrationally hostile to fish, but because the fish served in canteens was frequently low quality and poorly prepared. Bulk cooking in underfunded kitchens, with inconsistent supply and limited incentives, produced meals that could be greasy, overcooked, underseasoned, or simply monotonous. The smell alone became part of the folklore. People remembered the odor of cafeteria fish as something that invaded corridors and clothing, turning Thursday into a sensory warning. That is why Fish Day became not just a nutritional policy, but a cultural punchline. Officials worried about something else as well: productivity. If workers hated lunch, if they skipped meals, if they left the factory to search for alternatives, it could affect output. In a system obsessed with production targets and labor discipline, even lunch could be treated as an input to industrial performance. This concern helps explain why Fish Day was placed later in the week. If Thursday lunches were unpopular, the damage so the logic went might be contained. The state was trying to solve a meat shortage without creating a labor problem. It was a balancing act between feeding bodies and maintaining the tempo of work. And people adapted the way they always did in the Soviet Union, informally, privately, sometimes cynically. Many brought food from home on Thursdays if they could. Some tried to buy sausage sandwiches or anything that could break the monotony. Some skipped lunch. The very existence of these coping strategies exposes the limits of centralized dietary planning. The state could set the menu, but it could not stop people from seeking alternatives when they had the means. It could enforce fish in public catering, but it could not fully control what citizens did in their own kitchens or what they traded, hoarded, or carried in a bag to work. The jokes arrived because humor was one of the few safe ways to describe the absurdity of daily life. Fish Day became a target because it was predictable, intrusive, and widely shared. It was a policy that touched almost everyone, which made it perfect for folklore. When people joked that on Thursdays even brothels were full of mermaids, they were not simply being crude. They were marking Fish Day as a symbol of how the Soviet system could take something as intimate as appetite and turn it into a bureaucratic instruction. Humor, in this sense, was not an escape from politics. It was a way of commenting on it without namming it. What makes Fish Day historically revealing is that it sits at the intersection of crisis management, industrial ambition, propaganda, and everyday resistance. The first introduction in 1932 came out of a chain reaction triggered by collectivization and the collapse of livestock, with famine as the background reality that made the meat shortage more than a market fluctuation. Mikoyan's order was a technocratic response to a political disaster: substitute fish for meat, standardize it through canteens, and sell it as modern nutrition. The subsequent creation of fisheries institutions, culminating in a dedicated commissariat in 1939, showed how the state tried to turn that response into a long-term sectoral strategy. Jemchizhina's push for canning reflected the logistical reality of a vast country and the Soviet faith in industrial processing as a universal solution. The wartime interruption and the post-war canfish boom showed how fish products could fit the material conditions of reconstruction. The high seas expansion of the 1960s demonstrated Soviet capacity and also Soviet blind spots. Catching fish was not the same as integrating it into a satisfying food culture. And the 1976 decision to fix Fish Day on Thursday revealed the persistence of the underlying problem: meat shortages was still severe enough that the leadership returned to a policy last associated with the desperate early 1930s. The consequences were both immediate and long-term. Immediately, Fish Day redistributed demand. Even if people disliked it, it meant one less day per week when public dining demanded meat supplies at full scale. Over time, it helped normalize certain fish products, especially canned fish, as everyday staples. It also reinforced the role of the canteen as a tool of governance, a place where the state could implement policy not through police power but through menus. Yet it also created a shared memory of coercive consumption, a reminder that Soviet abundance was often staged and selective. The state could flood stores with certain items while failing to provide others consistently, and then it would ask citizens to adjust their desires accordingly. In the end, Thursday Fish Day was never really about fish alone. It was about the Soviet system's permanent struggle to reconcile ideology with biology, targets with taste, and centralized control with the stubborn reality of what people actually wanted to eat. The policy tried to turn a shortage into a habit and a habit into a virtue, using propaganda to make necessity sound like choice. But the jokes, the skipped lunches, and the enduring disgust in many memories show the other side of the story. When a state tries to manage life down to the level of the weekly menu, it risks turning food into a symbol of power, and power into something you can smell from the corridor. Today, Fish Day survives mostly as a phrase, a cultural artifact of late Soviet routine. Yet its logic has modern echoes. Governments still intervene in diets through public institutions, whether for health, economics, or ideology. Supply chains still shape what people consider normal food, and propaganda, commercial or political, still tries to persuade consumers that substitutes are upgrades. The Soviet Thursday Fish Day reminds us that what ends up on a plate is rarely just a culinary matter. It can be the final link in a chain of policy decisions stretching back decades, from the fields and factories to the ministries and fleets, and it can leave behind a memory that outlasts the system that created it, the taste of a planned solution and the bitter aftertaste of being told to enjoy it.